Hi and welcome to the first of our webinars in MRDC Software Week 2019. And in these series of webinars, we're going to be covering a different topic each day. Today we're starting with data collection. On Tuesday, tomorrow, we're moving on to data analysis. On Wednesday, we're looking at reporting. And on Thursday, we're looking at online communities and social media. With Friday, a panel discussion with a team of experts to discuss some of the things that have come up during our software week. So for today's webinar on data collection, I'm Phil Hearn and I'm joined by Charlotte, and we're going to be taking you through some of the issues that are coming up in software for data collection. And we started this business, if you like, with looking at what problems people had so that we could try to find solutions to problems that researchers had. And we conducted a survey amongst research executives and business owners of research companies, but focusing on research agencies, to look at some of the problems they had. And the one we can look at today is the data collection issues. And what we're trying to do in this software week is to try and focus on areas where software can make a difference and look at things that are real problems that people in research agencies encounter, so that we can open up a discussion and help, perhaps try and help to find ways that will improve what you get from your software and how you operate as a company. It really isn't a sales presentation, this series of webinars this week. If you've come online to listen to this webinar and you think you're going to hear about our products and hear us selling you the benefits of our products, this is not the right place. We're more than happy to do that at the right time, but that's not what this week's about. This week is about looking at issues and seeing if both, not just we, but the industry as a whole can solve your problems and to help you make better decisions in how you choose software and how you actually use it as well. So it's to open up a discussion. We hope to offer some ideas on how you can improve what you do, perhaps to rethink some of your strategy. I think the software market has got very complicated in market research in the last few years. It wasn't so many years ago that I remember that was probably a piece of software for doing some cross tabulations, and that was about it. And then we started doing some PowerPoint slides to give to our clients. But it's really moved on a lot since then, since the days of CATI. Now a lot of research is online, and there's a lot of passive data collection now, and social media analysis and so on. So data that's used in market research has really exploded in the last 10, 15, 20 years. And it really does mean that choosing the right software has got more difficult because so many products overlap with each other. So what we're going to talk about today, we're going to not particularly focus on any methodology, although I suspect there'll be more coverage of what's going on in online surveys, because that brings up more issues, if you like. But we are going to include information and ideas on PAPI, or pen and paper interviews, CAPI, CATI, and online surveys. Now, we're not going to include passive data collection in this webinar, qualitative data or social media data. Qualitative and social media we're covering in our webinar on Thursday, and passive data collection, and often that's referred to as big data, we're going to cover that a little in the reporting webinar on Wednesday. So before I hand on to Charlotte, I'm just going to say that she's going to introduce you to some of the findings from our survey, some of the points that people raised as being issues in software relating to data collection. I think one of the things that came out of it for me was that sometimes finding the right software that suits your particular needs and your future needs can be difficult. And that's something that we're perhaps going to hopefully give you some pointers so that to help you choose the software that suits you. You may have seen some of our blog articles that discuss these sorts of topics in big detail, and we like to feel that we're unbiased in trying to give people help into choosing what suits them and not believing that necessarily our products are the right products for everybody, even though, of course, we really want you to buy them. So I'm going to hand over to Charlotte now, and she's going to take you through some of those findings and lead that into some of the topics that came out of that, and I'll be back a little bit later in the webinar.
Thanks, Phil. So some of you may know that we conducted a survey amongst market researchers recently to find out problems that they encountered with their survey softwares. And here are some of the things that came out of this. We found a range of different issues that came up, and they kind of grouped into various different types. Some of the problems were to do with response rates and the quality of the market research that's been conducted. That might be the quality of the data, the accuracy of it, whether the people in the panel were relevant. And then there was another group of issues, which was actual software issues themselves in terms of choosing the right software, and in many cases, the cost that's incurred. So the difference between low-cost software packages and the dearer ones that are out there on the market. There's another group of problems that were cited, which was functionality issues. And I'm sure if we had a bigger sample, there'd have been a lot more problems that had arisen. But the sort of things that were coming out for this were things like logic and skip patterns. And what I mean by that is complex filtering. There was things like availability of GPS, so things like that were coming out. Another issue we had was data integration. And there's plenty of softwares out there that collect the data, but it's what we're going to do with it afterwards. And in some cases, it's just a click button and it easily exports out of one bit of software and into another. Other softwares, it does it all in one package for you, so you don't need to export the data out. And some softwares, actually, it's a really complex procedure to do that. So that's the main issues we have. And to put those into sort of categories, we had survey issues, we had purchase issues, software issues, and data issues. And Phil and I are going to have a look at all these topics now and take you through in a bit more detail throughout this webinar. So let's have a look at the survey issues that came up. The first thing to probably say at first sight of this was they're not really software issues. It's easy for software companies to say all the problems are with conducting it, particularly with your online surveys or your CATI surveys, are connected with willingness of the respondents or the suitability of the sample. So things like that we're kind of blaming when actually it could be the software that's the problem. So if you haven't got the right software, your response rates could be much lower. So getting engaging surveys really is important. And it breaks down into making the survey more interesting, so it's easier to work with. And one of the things that I feel fairly strongly about is I've received surveys online from companies where they might look very nice, they've been put together nicely, but it's not that easy to actually understand. So having a questionnaire that's clean, clear and easy is actually really important. And that goes into trying to keep surveys interesting. And that can be difficult, as not every topic is actually really interesting that we're doing surveys on. So you want to keep it for people very engaging so they're willing to actually take part. It will vary with those things. So between paper, online and CATI surveys will all be slightly different. With a CATI survey, you have an advantage. You've got an interviewer who can actually take control. They can make the odd joke. They can encourage the respondent to keep going. Whereas online, you don't actually have that. So, for example, online, things like big grids really is a bit of a turn-off. People just don't want to do it. It's not easy on the eye. It's very boring and laborious to actually do. So you need to try and do it in different ways. You can do things like drag and drop. So, for example, you can have your very good, very poor and poors, and you could just drag things in rather than just tick boxing. Again, it's just getting people more likely to fill in longer surveys and keeping them engaged and interested. Images are also a good option. So again, it's easy on the eye. So you can have a male and female symbol, which would look much nicer than just the word male and female. You can do this for anything that looks nicer, but it has to be 100% intuitive, so they know exactly what they're doing. So being able to keep the survey clean and easy to understand is really important. Talking to respondents is good. Videos work very well online. It keeps people nice and engaged. Showing progress, being honest with how your progress is really important too. And I know there's actually been research that shows if we thank someone for filling in the survey halfway through and let them know how they're getting on, they're actually more likely to continue the survey and not just press the X button in the top corner. The temptation just to give up on a survey really is very easy now. So we need to keep them engaged and let them know how they're getting on. I'm going to go on to a few examples here of different things you can have to keep people engaged. So let's have a look at this. We've got, the first one is an online survey here. You've got some nice visual here. You've got different flags for different countries here. Again, rather than to drop down list of different countries, which is quite boring, we've got some nice pictures of flags. Again, it's engaging, hopefully keeping people interested. The next one is using nice infographics. You've got smiley faces there. Again, anyone could fill in that survey. It's simple, it's to the point. So again, that's a nice, simple survey for online to fill in. We've got a paper survey here. So again, these are really important to be able to produce clean, simple surveys for paper. So again, you can see nice, clear instructions. You can have different logos, so people will be familiar with the Facebook logo, the Twitter logo. I'm sure you've all seen these before, and just click on different logos. Back to the visual image. So again, we've got pictures here. So if you're not good at remembering names, if you're anything like me, you might not be, but I would remember a picture and what someone looks like. I'm much better with visual reminders. We've got sliding scales here, so you can see here you've got a party of 3 adults and 9 children. Sounds like quite hard work to me, but rather than just sort of typing in 3 or clicking on 3, you're sliding it along. Again, interactive, keeping people interested in the surveys. So we've got some drag and drop features here we were talking about earlier. And again, this is what we were saying, rather than having tick boxes for your very good and your pause, you can drag it and drop it along. At the end of the day, what we're trying to do is really keep our respondents engaged and not getting bored and just clicking that X and thinking, I've had enough of this. And actually something I learned from an SMR conference, it's actually about 4 or 5 years ago now. There's a speaker, John Paulston, who's actually very well respected in market research and a really good speaker. One of the things he demonstrated was with facts to back it up from a project that he actually did, was showing that as a respondent, if they're engaged, will actually fill in a longer survey if it's interesting. So by way of example, we put a survey out that was very boring, not very engaging, nothing very exciting in there, tick boxes, things like that. And he also put out a survey with drag and drop, show cards, nice infographics. And it actually turned out that people were willing to do longer surveys if they were interested, as opposed to a really boring, shorter survey. So we're always going on about keeping surveys short so they're online. They've got to be short, which isn't necessarily the case. As long as it's engaging, then you can make it slightly longer and you will get people getting to the end of that survey. Putting in the effort into the questionnaire and having the software to achieve this is a really important thing. So I think on that note, we're going to pass back to Phil now, who's going to take you through some more of these topics. Over to you, Phil.
Okay, thanks, Charlotte. I'd like to continue by looking at some other issues or types of issues now that came out of that survey. And one of the tough ones sometimes, I think, when choosing the right software for your data collection is features. It's very easy to get wound up about features. I've seen people not buy a product because it has a feature that doesn't matter really, and equally I've seen them overlook a feature that's actually quite important to their whole business get neglected. And there's some good reasons for that. Features in software tend to be overwhelming to deal with, and I think the place to start is to think about the complexity that you need. And when we look at data collection, there are various bits of software that can create questionnaires, that can produce online surveys, paper surveys, and so on. So the first thing to think about is, what is it that matters to you? Do you just want paper surveys, something that creates a paper questionnaire? Do you want it to be online? Or do you need it actually available in different modes? And all these are important questions, I think, that you have to ask yourself as to what you need. And the complexity of the questionnaires, there's plenty actually now of free software. You could even use Google Forms to conduct a survey quite successfully. Where if you don't want any complexity, why buy a piece of software that handles things that are complex? You might just want a simple solution. So let's move on and look at some of those things and that you, I think, perhaps need to consider when you're choosing the right software. And it often starts with either a checklist of things on a website that you can look at, or perhaps taking a trial and conducting a test for yourself. And a tip I always think that works best for when you're conducting a trial is to pick for your trial an average survey. I've seen people either do a trial with the easiest project they've ever done, and of course it's not really a test, and then start to struggle when they start perhaps doing something that's more complex, or they pick the most difficult project they've ever had to handle in their life and then wonder why it's difficult to use in a piece of software that they're not familiar with. So pick something that's typical of your work. That may be difficult. Some companies do very similar surveys and that makes it easy. For other companies that's quite difficult. But start within what you might call an average survey and see whether that's easy, difficult, or meets your needs before you proceed. Then you can move on and worry about features. And I find actually many software suppliers like to give you a list of features on their website, particularly some of the online ones where you can buy a basic or a premium or some other gold edition that gets more and more expensive as you go through the price bands. And what I recommend is that don't spend too much time looking at checklists that software suppliers have given you. They can be okay if you want to find just to check one particular thing, but I find you get much more value if you produce your own checklist, perhaps in a spreadsheet, and ask the software supplier to say yes, no, or comment, or tell you the maximum number of records that you can handle, because then it's evaluating the things that are important to you. And yes, you might still forget one or two things, but I think it's on your terms, and I think you'll get more from it. And it also means that you're thinking about what it is that's important to you, rather than just being hit with a wall of information from a software supplier who is perhaps trying to hide something that might be important from you. So have your own checklist, but by all means look at what checklists of features are available, but have your own. And I think also look at deal breakers. One of the things I've always, in terms of running a business, and this doesn't apply to software only, is I've always looked at things that actually break a deal, whether that's a partnership with another company, whether that's taking some marketing decision, whatever it might be in business. I tend to look for things that are deal breakers, and I think that's something you should do when buying software. Is there something that, if it doesn't work to your level of satisfaction, that means it really isn't worth anything or as much as if it does? And that might be something like GPS that you need in your online interviews. You might want to be able to synchronize CAPI interviews and have that as reliable. It might be something to do with quota management. All sorts of things might come up, but think of the things that would be deal breakers if they didn't work to your satisfaction. And sort of against that, and perhaps to balance that, is that I also say don't get hung up on a minor feature being missing. Sometimes I think people, when they're buying software, can get hung up on one particular feature, and if it's not a deal breaker, maybe it doesn't matter, because when it comes down to it, what an online survey about particularly is being clear for respondents and engaging enough so that they get to the end of it. And another thing to look for with software features, I think, particularly if you want to run software surveys across different platforms or different devices, is can it handle mixed mode properly, or is it handling multiple modes? All right, let's move on to some data issues now. And I think this is one where often too little time is spent. And I give a good reason for this, and that's because in many companies there's a DP team or a team doing data processing, or maybe a person in a smaller company who does the data processing. And data processing people tend to be very good at sorting out problems. That's what they're good at. They're good at getting things done fast, and if you give them a pile of data that is not really in a very helpful form, but you tell them you want some results from it, they'll sort it out, because that's what their job is, at finding solutions to problems. And they may not complain, but that might mean that they're actually, in terms of how the company works, being very inefficient. So if you're buying software that's got to integrate with something else, maybe your tabulations, your reporting, how you do your PowerPoints, whatever it might be, an online dashboard, it's important to check that it's easy. And I have come across quite often DP staff saying things, oh, this is really easy to do, but actually it takes them 5 hours of easy work to get perhaps some data out of one survey platform and into another one. Sometimes you might find the data can only come out in Excel format, and then if that's a tracking study where you want to merge it to the previous week's data, where perhaps one or two questions have changed, that could be quite a cumbersome task, and suddenly you've got somebody in data processing spending a day just sorting out the data so it can be tabulated and put into some perhaps PowerPoint reports or whatever it is you do with that data. And finally, I want to look at some purchase issues that I think come up. It's difficult with purchase issues because they will vary obviously from person to person what's important, and I have often found that recommendations can actually be more of a hindrance than a help, because it's easy to go to a conference and say, what do you use for data collection or something like that, but if that person's not got the same business structure in place, it's got different types of people, it's got different types of work, different software, as I just talking about further down for doing analysis and reporting, that tool might not be the best tool. So recommendations, I think, can be a hindrance sometimes, and actually finding out for yourself is actually really quite important. And I think one of the things to consider is how important is it to you, because I've seen people looking at buying the cheapest bit of software on the market when actually the importance to their business is very high. They're perhaps collecting 250,000 interviews a year or something like that online, so therefore they want the right software that's going to make all the other processes really easy. They're going to want their staff to be really efficient and being able to set up questionnaires really quickly and easily without making mistakes. Whereas if you're doing one survey a year of 100 people, if that takes a long time to set up, as long as it gets the data in accurately and is usable, that might not be so important. So thinking about how valuable a piece of software to you is, I think, a major decision, and should be very influential on what sort of cost you're prepared to accept, and what bracket you look at. And functionality, well, again, what's desirable and what's essential. I think there's a tendency with functionality sometimes to say, I want all these features, when actually, if you split them down to what's essential and what's desirable, you can get a much better balance on that. Or even if you perhaps break them down into some scoring of how important they are to you, you get some feel. I think sometimes you've got to look at who's going to be using that software. Do they want a piece of software that's going to be easy for them to pick up? Let's say you've got 10 people who all want to use your questionnaire development tool for an online survey, or even a paper survey, whatever it might be, or a CATI survey, and 10 different people need to set that question up because of the way that you're structured. It's got to be easy to use because they're probably going to be using it once or twice a year. Whereas if your operation runs where one person or one team set up every single questionnaire, and they have a lot of surveys to handle, really the look and feel of it doesn't really matter very much. They just want to be able to do it efficiently, and they'll get familiar with the interface and how they do it. And I think that's something it's important to consider, who the user is of a particular piece of software. And that carries over into training costs. I know of software on the market that presents itself as easy to use, but actually when it comes to it, it's a full scripting language. There's not much you can do through the user interface using simple menus. Actually, when it comes to producing any commercial questionnaire, you've got to learn a complex syntax just to develop a questionnaire, and that needs a 3-day training course. And if that's 5 people doing a 3-day training course and it's chargeable as well, that can add up to quite a lot of money, and practice and time to get up to the skills levels that are needed to use it efficiently. So think about the level of software that you're buying and what training it needs, because I think that can become a shock to people sometimes. I mentioned already that does it fit in with other things that you do. I've also briefly touched on whether you pick on scripting versus GUI, graphical user interface software. I think it varies what you do. If you have high volume and people are using scripting day in, day out, scripting works. If they're only occasional users, scripting becomes very difficult because people forget commands that they've got to put in place, and generally make mistakes. Whereas in which case, if they're occasional users, they'll want a friendly user interface that guides them through the questionnaire, even though that might take longer than some of the wonderful shortcuts a scripting language might take. And typically, people using a user interface will make less errors than people using scripting. Even the best people at scripting make mistakes. And finally, a couple of points at the end here on purchase issues. Do you want an upgrade path? I think that's something that's often neglected. It is worth trying to think ahead to what you're going to be doing in a 1 or 2 years' time. And the reason I say that, not so much from a cost aspect, it's the fact that if you've got tracking studies or things like that, moving them from one platform to another when you've outgrown a piece of software can be quite time consuming and difficult. And so I would advise thinking about what you think you might want in a year or two's time, and that might be based on estimated volumes of work that you're taking on, or complexity of work that you'll be taking on, and so on. So something to think about, certainly. And I have also suggested to many customers that they take 2 products rather than 1, and that's because I think there's quite a gulf between complex questionnaires and simple ones. A simple questionnaire of 5 easy questions that everybody answered has just got to be clear to a respondent and doesn't need a high-level piece of software, and can be done very cheaply with probably free or very inexpensive software, whereas something that's more complex or very complex would probably need a higher end range piece of software. And I don't think there's any reason sometimes not to consider using 2 bits of software for different types of work, because it might reduce your costs significantly and actually make you more competitive in terms of what turnarounds you can offer and how you approach it, and having staff flexibility. So that's what I'm going to wrap up on purchase issues. We have actually conducted a full webinar on the topic of purchase issues, and if you want to look at the blog article or the video that goes with that, you can go to bit.ly, choosing the right software, and there's a lot of more detail than perhaps we've covered in this fairly short webinar here. But at that point, I'm going to throw it open to questions, and I believe some have already come through, so we're going to start taking those questions now before we wrap up at the end.
Great, thanks a lot, Phil. So, yeah, we have got a few questions that have come in already. So let's have a look what we've got. So we have, I didn't understand your comment about mixed modes versus multiple modes. Can you please explain that?
Good point. I don't think I did explain that very fully. I didn't, in fact. So good question. The difference between mixed modes and multiple modes is that a true mixed mode piece of software will handle different types of data collection as though it's one survey, and importantly keep all the data as one file, which is all married together or merged together. So if you're handling a survey with mixed mode software, where you've got perhaps some online surveys, some perhaps have been mailed out for people to complete themselves, they'll all be held in one database so that the data's together and therefore are easy to work with. There's quite a lot of products on the market that handle multiple modes, and they'll treat each type separately. So effectively there's sort of 3 different software products if there's 3 modes of collection, and sometimes putting that data together can be quite a tricky exercise or time-consuming exercise. So mixed mode is where the data is really properly integrated, regardless of the way you're collecting that data, whether it be paper, CAPI, CATI, or whatever, or online.
Great, thank you. We've got another one here. Is SSS the best way to convert data from one program to another program?
It can be. It's a good way. It's a good standard anyway. I don't know the figures off the top of my head, but I think something like 60 to 70 software programs that are in the market research space are SSS compliant, which means that if you export data into SSS from one piece of software, you can pull it back into another one, and the data will be compatible, and the text for all the questions will also all be there. Now, that doesn't mean to say that's the only way of linking software, and it doesn't, of course, mean if you're not one of the 60, 70 programs that support SSS that helps you at all. So it's a good starting point, and it's something that a lot of software suppliers adhere to. But it's worth going to I think it's called triple-s.org website to check whether they are compliant. But the ways of communicating from one bit of software to another there may be other ways. It's just checking out what's compliant, what has easy to move data formats, so that when you go to the next process, whether that be reporting or tabulations, whatever it might be, that's an easy process and not one that takes somebody all day to perform.
Thanks, Phil. We've got a couple more here. Is it better for questionnaires to look good with use of colours, or should they be mainly text?
I think my answer to that would be clarity is the important thing. Certainly use colours to make them more attractive, but not to the extent that it denigrates the ease of reading. So I think what works best, and there's been research on this, is clear questionnaires where it's obvious what people have got to do, and they're not overly clever with too many hieroglyphics or whatever it might be, or distractions. So I think it's perfectly acceptable to have a very plain looking screen, and that's been proven to work well. There's a difference between a plain looking screen and a boring screen. As I think Charlotte mentioned in her part of the presentation, it's important to make the questionnaire engaging, particularly online, and give people different ways of doing things. But whether it's use of colours against text, I don't think that's the issue really. It's clarity and keeping the questionnaire engaging.
Thanks, Phil. We just got one more here. What, in your opinion, are the three best data collection software packages, and they're the free ones?
Sorry, can you say that again? The best.
What are the best 3 free data collection software packages?
The free ones. I think somebody want me to say here that there's 3 free ones better than our ones. I don't know. I think you've got to decide for yourself. You've got to look at the features that they have and decide whether they're good enough for you. I mean, Google Forms, for example, if you subscribe to Google, is free as far as I know, and if it does what you want, use it. I'm sure it's very solid and very reliable, and would be a good choice if it's good enough. If it's not good enough, it's obviously shouldn't be considered. I think you have to decide. I mean, there's a section in the presentation talking about having your checklist of things rather than the software supplier's checklist. And I think that's a good discipline, to write your own things down that are important to you and get into reasonable detail, and then decide what's the best 3 products for you, whether they be free or not free. So slightly dodging that question, but I think it'll be different solutions to different people.
Great. Well, that's all the questions we've got come through for this session. Before we round up, I'll just take you through quickly for the rest of the week, what's happening with our software week. So at 8:30 a.m. and at 3 p.m. UK time, we've got tomorrow, Tuesday, we've got analysis. Wednesday, we've got reporting. Thursday, we've got online communities and social media. And Friday, we'll have an expert panel discussion. And if you want to get in contact with us regarding any more questions that come up over this week and different questions, feel free to drop me an email and we can get back to you on anything like that. We've also got our blogs on our website that have plenty of information with these topics that we'll be covering. So please visit our website. And I think that's everything for today. So thanks a lot, Phil, and thanks everyone for turning up.
Thank you.